You know, I really wish I was exaggerating when I say how hard it was to find one of these without a hole in the back. Hi y'all, SnarkyJay cosplay here. I know what you're thinking, wow SnarkyJay, don't you look oddly feminine today with a little flower in your hair? Well, ladies and gentlemen, that is because this is a video that I've been thinking about making for, I shit you not, probably over 10 years at this point, and I've thought about this topic and I've thought about it, and I know that this is probably going to be one of the more deranged videos I've ever made, so I'm trying to soften the blow by dressing really cute so that when I start losing my shit in a few minutes, it's not quite as terrible. Of course, the whole reason for this impassioned rant that I'm about to go into is how the Grinch stole Christmas. No, it's actually how the bronies ruined My Little Pony, tarnished the internet, and basically destroyed a beloved children's property where no little girl ever wanted to touch it again. And I wish I was exaggerating, but this is a very real thing that happened to me. You might be sitting there thinking, Jay, what the f is a brony? And if you're asking yourself what a brony is, baby, I want you to know how jealous I am that you didn't live through what I lived through. But join me, because in this video, I'm not only going to explain to you what a brony is, I'm going to talk about the adverse effects that they had on the property that they so misappropriated. But to get into the meat and potatoes of this video, to tell you what a brony is, we first need to start with what the brony covets. And that leads me into talking about My Little Pony. Yes, ladies and gentlemen, I just turned 25 a few days ago, but we're talking about My Little Pony. So My Little Pony was launched by Hasbro in 1983 as a toy line and also a cartoon aimed at young girls. If we think about Transformers being the iconic Hasbro toy for boys that eventually had a cartoon, but basically they were designed just to sell toys, that's kind of what My Little Pony was for girls. So girls had horses with stickers on their asses, and boys had cars that turned into robots. I think we know who drew the short straw here, but anyway. My Little Pony was a huge success for Hasbro in the 80s, and it basically had multiple iterations over the next few decades as people got older, designs changed, styles changed. Gen 1 was very much marked by the 80s, they were all sugary sweet, and they had a very pastel, soft aesthetic for the girls that they were made for. Gen 2 gave us My Little Pony Tales. The designs weren't all that different, but they were more slice of life, the storylines in the cartoons were a little more grounded. Then My Little Pony sort of lost its way and lost its popularity with the third generation, which is most often forgotten, and it was direct to video and incredibly unsuccessful for Hasbro. Now the big issue with each and every generation of My Little Pony before my generation, Gen 4, was that they were basically just aimed at selling toys. That was the whole purpose. The storytelling was really light on any real quality. There wasn't a lot of conflict. I mean, they were incredibly boring because the only thing they wanted girls to do was to buy the little horses and brush their hair. Need I remind you that with Transformers, they literally were the first brush with death a lot of boys in the 80s had because they f***ing killed off Optimus Prime, and little girls were just expected to braid hair forever. That is, until 2010. In 2010, Hasbro hires the prolific Faust, whose name was previously attached to other popular children's projects like Foster's Home for Imaginary Friends and the Powerpuff Girls. Hasbro brings her on to develop the fourth generation of My Little Pony media, which was titled My Little Pony Friendship is Magic. Her goal was to create something smart, funny, engaging, and empowering for young girls, something most cartoons for young girls just weren't, and something that My Little Pony had never been. In regards to My Little Pony, she famously said, "We live in a society where saying that something is for girls is the equivalent to saying that something is stupid or saying that something isn't worthwhile. I think that's awful, and I think that kind of attitude needs to be changed." Faust was the first person to look at My Little Pony and think that there was no reason why cartoons for girls couldn't be as engaging, as smart, and as action-packed as the ones made for boys. And so with My Little Pony Friendship is Magic, otherwise known as Gen 4, there was a renaissance, the likes of which My Little Pony had never scene. She established a main six main characters that each had distinct aesthetics as well as super different personalities. There was a bookworm, there was a fancy one, there was a shy animal lover, there was a tomboy who was a Pegasus, there was a cowgirl. I'm forgetting the sixth one liked cake. That was like her whole thing. But they all had incredibly distinct personalities. I'm simplifying it for the sake of argument. But they were actually really different characters. Each one had their own struggles. Each one had their own talents. They all brought something different to the table. And there was definitely something in each character where a little girl could look at it and be like, I'm that one. I was a Rainbow Dash. The whole point is that Lauren Faust's involvement artistically elevated the entire show. Animation, writing, voice acting, they all got major upgrades. And they made the fourth generation of My Little Pony into a viral sensation. And now, ladies and gentlemen, the thing nobody could have expected. The birth of the Brony. The show premieres in October of 2010, and grown men from weird pockets of the internet like Reddit and 4chan, they all flock to watch My Little Pony, initially ironically. And they start off slow. Initially, they just meme the show because it's fun to make fun of shows made for little kids that have nothing to do with you. So initially they meme it. And then this process of memeing, or memification, memery, whatever you want to call it, it leads to an odd fascination by these people that comes from within. From all the time that they spend looking at it and making fun of it, they develop an odd fascination and even an attachment to the show and the show's characters. And then the fascination continues to spiral, and it becomes obsession. And then from obsession, of course, we lean further into fanaticism, which then becomes fandom. And thus we got the bronies. If the word isn't self-explanatory, it is a combination of bro and pony. It basically was just a good label for them to say, I'm a grown man and I watch My Little Pony and I think that's cool. Hey, I'm not here to tell anybody what they should or shouldn't watch. I'm not here to tell you you're too old or too young to do anything. You want to watch My Little Pony? Go ahead. And that's what they did. They watched My Little Pony. They watched. But boy, did they do a whole lot more. Before we get into what the bronies did, let's talk about the demographic of the brony. Typically, these were men. The brony label ended up later being applied to women as well, just women that were probably beyond the age that the show was intended for. Most women in that age range preferred the term Pegasister, but for the sake of argument, we're gonna go with brony as a general label. The people that flew flags under the brony banner were 85% male, and the demographic was about between the ages of like 18 and 35, prime internet years if you ask me. And many of them self-identified as socially isolated or introverted. But they developed this fascination with My Little Pony, which I think is honestly a testament to how well produced Generation 4 was. The writing, yes, was juvenile, but surprisingly good and actually had a lot of depth, probably even deeper than some of the little girls we're watching would even notice. It was colorful escapism with good story, good quality writing. As the name implies, there was a really big emphasis on friendship, and there was also a lot riding on the subject of emotional intelligence throughout the entire show. And so My Little Pony went from just being a show for little girls to something that felt like a safe space for men with traditionally non-masculine interests. And if that had been the full extent of it, I would not be sitting here making this video today. So a little bit about me and my experience, because I know everybody loves to hear me talk about myself. I know that I am the image of rock and roll coolness and rebellion today when I'm sitting here talking about Star Wars in my action figure and Lego covered room. But I'll let you in on a little secret. I was kind of a dork. When there was an ad for a website for kids or a game or something, and they would give the disclaimer at the end, ask your parents' permission before visiting this website or before making an account, I was the one kid that actually asked for my parents' permission. And my parents did their best to make sure that I grew up sheltered from nastiness, from bad words, from inappropriate content. My dad used to drop me off at elementary school every morning. And there were two songs mainly that he would play to keep me from panicking about being left alone at school because I hated school. One of them was We Right Here by DMX, and the other one was Watch This by Swollen Members. I'm not going to play either of those songs for copyright purposes, but if you go and check them out yourself, there is so much colorful language in both of those songs, and my dad, to protect my innocent baby ears from hearing any of the words that would later paint my vocabulary as an adult, he would drive with one hand on the wheel and the other hand on the mute knob. I didn't know what half of that song sounded like because he'd just be sitting there muting it, so I never had to hear any of DMX or Swollen Members cursing. That's the childhood that I was raised with. So between the ages of 10 and 11, I unfortunately have to make the change from soft and gentle elementary school to a middle school full of fiends and miscreants. But I cling to my childhood because I've been a late bloomer and super immature for my entire life. And my back then was My Little Pony. Oh my God, I loved those colorful horses. Holy shit. They were so cute, they were so cool, the stories were so great, the animation was beautiful, and that, folks, is where my lifelong feud with the bronies begins. Why? Because I have loved drawing for my entire life. My handwriting to this day is horrific because I learned to draw before I went to school to learn how to write. Drawing has been literally the center of my world since I was a child. And watching My Little Pony and seeing these beautiful designs and these adorable little horses, the only thing I wanted to do at age 11 was draw these ponies. I wanted to learn how they were illustrated, I wanted to draw them, and I wanted to make ponies just like that. So when you want to draw, and the show isn't on TV, and even if it was on TV, you can't pause it because you don't have a DVR in your room, and you're 11 years old, and you pick up your iPod Touch or Pro or whatever the hell it was that I had back then, and you look up My Little Pony art. Or more specifically, looking up the object of my obsessions, my favorite pony, Rainbow Dash art. When I tell you that this single-handedly set me off on a video that would be made 13, 14 years later, every fucking time that I looked up My Little Pony art, Rainbow Dash art, Fluttershy art, I came across the most obscene, atrocious, unimaginably repulsive, horrific shit because somehow Google Safe Search did not protect me. So the first, two little boxes would be regular pictures from the show. And then the rest of it was something the bronies like to call clop, which was basically just fucking porn. I would see images of these ponies entertaining themselves with hooves. I don't even know how that works, and you know what? I don't want to know how it works. And there was no escape because it was all right there. There was no concealing it. It was literally the top results when you would look it up. And so I remember the first time I ever saw anything, I scrolled very quickly past to get away from it because I couldn't really understand what I was looking at. I was 11 at this point, and on top of that, I didn't want to get in trouble for anyone thinking that that's what I was looking for. All I was trying to do was draw ponies, and the search results were fucking polluted. I tried performing the same search today, and Google Safe Search has gotten really, really good about blurring out or completely hiding NSFW images. This is probably the weirdest thing I could find right off the top of my head without directly searching up Clop or Rule 34, which I didn't want to do. And even then, why is this image of Rainbow Dash so suggestive? Why is she looking at me like that? What the f is going on here? But if the art wasn't enough, let's continue. I love stuffed animals. I have collected plushies and stuffed animals since I was a kid. And back in the day, I discovered Etsy, which had all kinds of handmade stuffed animals. And you know what a lot of the stuffed animals on Etsy had? A lot of the ponies, Rainbow Dash, Fluttershy, Rarity, Twilight Sparkle, Applejack, and Pinkie Pie, they all had holes sewn in the back. I don't even want to get into detail about what these holes were for. There were people hand sewing and hand embroidering ponies and leaving a pocket in its rear end for the imaginations of people on 4chan. This cost me like $70 worth of my Christmas money. I assure you she has no holes. She's fine. She has been well cared for. And to be honest, as I've gotten older, I am so glad that I saved this Fluttershy from whatever her fate would have been had a man in his 30s acquired her in 2012. And if the fan art and the stuffed animals with the holes wasn't enough, there was an entire meme and a story about a jar. A Rainbow Dash figurine was put in a jar, and a man took his time in filling this jar with a liquid that I shall not name. And I will cover the image of this liquid because I don't want to get into that. But he left Rainbow Dash in this jar for months. This jar sat on a radiator. And that was the fate of Rainbow Dash after she was introduced to the Brony on the internet. Was boiling in a jar filled with, on a radiator in a grown man's room. You know what'll ruin a child's innocence worse than the lyrics of DMX, may he rest in peace? Seeing Rainbow Dash being violated. That's what. Alright, so I know I've been picking on bronies for about 20 minutes at this point, but it's not just the bronies. Internet culture and the fetishization of childhood media somehow go hand in hand. Rule number 34 of the internet states that if it exists, there is of it. If you look at a fandom like Sonic the Hedgehog, that is actually a notoriously not safe for work fandom for reasons I don't understand. But the thing that scares me about that is that there is a difference between infantilization and fetishization. I understand, as an adult that functions in today's world, in today's society, and we see so many horrible things, we see so many disappointments, and I'm also very much in the age where I'm like far enough away from my childhood to not live in that childhood, but I'm close enough to it to remember those days, and I can understand the temptation after a long day to go, you know what? I wish I could sit down with some juvenile media like My Little Pony and sit down and eat dinosaur nuggets out of a Zoo Pal's plate and just fucking be a kid for an afternoon. And for a lot of people, that's what a show like My Little Pony or content like Sonic, like that's why people get into juvenile media again. Because they want to cling to those childhood characters, they want to cling to those fantasies, and they want to cling to that escape. It's an escape from daily life, from adult life. It's nice. We all dream in some way or another of being a kid again. And I think content like My Little Pony Friendship is Magic gave that to people. The problem isn't when the adults decide to just be kids for a minute and enjoy the kids' content. The problem is when the adults want to drag the kids' content with them into adult spaces, into adult scenarios. And so now, instead of the ponies studying friendship, they are studying each other's anatomy in ways that are just unnatural. And that's what happens when adult fandoms consume media intent for children with no boundaries, because the internet really has no boundaries. The boundaries, again, have definitely gotten better. I noticed that when I was researching for this video. They've definitely gotten better, but they're still very unclear, especially when it comes to social media and other places where people post art. And so it kind of begs the question, is this just cringe? Or is it like deeply unhealthy and kind of weird? I think the answer to that question isn't really a simple answer. But the thing with the bronies is that it eventually led to not just fan entitlement, but a demand for fan service. The bronies eventually came to be a big enough group, almost larger than the demographic the show was originally intended for. And they organized conventions, they made fan films, and they made petitions for things that they wanted or didn't want to see in the show. In petitions and on online forums like Reddit, 4chan, and other social media, including DeviantArt, they started making demands for different representation, for different characters, even for specific character arcs, and they also demanded the inclusion of certain characters in more than they were ever meant to be in. The showrunners eventually became hip to what the bronies were trying to get at, so they started putting in more and more references for the bronies to pick up on and then lose their shit on Reddit over. They added arcs for ponies that were basically just background personalities that bronies just latched onto. One of which was Derpy Hooves, which was basically just a goofy background character, but she blew up on the internet. And they also started leaning into content that they knew would be brony coded and therefore would get them that much more views and would probably help them sell more toys to the grown men that were basically just taking over the show. And so right as of the end of season 1, the showrunners were basically stuck in this really odd and unexpected balancing act, where they were still trying to please little girls and produce content for little girls, but they were also trying to work with the interests of grown men on the internet. And somehow, I don't think the interests of grown men on the internet really align with the interests of little girls. It literally became such a huge thing that Hasbro eventually just started leaning into it with their merchandise and with different conventions. Honestly, I don't know how they did it, because their target audience was 6, but their biggest fan was 26. And so eventually the internet starts getting a little weird about bronies, because at first they were kind of embraced because it was so many of them, but then the internet starts going like, why are grown men watching My Little Pony? And so the show started getting the very early stages of gender politics, which really weren't that big a deal in like 2011, 2012 at this point. The bronies eventually started framing their whole fandom and movement as something progressive and feminist, like, yeah, men like My Little Pony too, we're just like you and it's all good. The funny thing about that is that female fans of My Little Pony, even the ones that were in the same demographic as your typical brony, so like 18 to 35, they were often sidelined and abused in fandom spaces by the men that felt that they had some kind of ownership over the show. The reclaiming of My Little Pony by women, and most importantly, the little girls that the show was made for, was somehow labeled as more problematic and less valid than the phenomenon of the brony. Even Lauren Faust, you know, the girls' champion who came in to produce good media for little girls so that they could really dream big and engage with some awesome content, she left after season 2, supposedly because of creative limitations, which may or may not be tied to the brony phenomenon and how Hasbro decided to lean into it. Essentially, what we were watching in real time, even though I didn't realize it then because I was part of the group being erased, but it was the erasure of girl-focused media being taken over and changed by adult male fandom. And I think the biggest crime and the biggest loss in the grand scheme of things was that the internet fundamentally changed the perception of the entire show. And I would say it ruined it. My Little Pony Friendship is Magic went from a cute kids show to an internet meme factory. And then parents started not letting their daughters watch the show. I got chased out myself because I honestly got sick of seeing the things that I saw, and I was so repulsed by it that I said, you know what? If I can't draw them, which is such a big part of my love for media, is to draw it, to recreate it, to cosplay it now as an adult, I said if I can't draw it and I can't engage with it in a way that makes me happy, then I'm just not gonna watch it. And I literally made the decision at like 11 and a half or 12 to stop watching My Little Pony. Not because I thought it was cringe or because I was too old for it, but because I was sick of the bronies doing everything gross on the internet with it. And parents started to feel the same way, because parents that did any research at all about the show before letting their daughters watch it would inevitably come across all the clop and Rule 34 and the jars and the stuffed animals with the holes in them, and they said, holy shit, I'm not letting my 10-year-old girl anywhere near this. The bronies' fetishization of the entire show literally overshadowed the show's original and much more important purpose, which was to entertain and empower young girls. And look, this happens to so many more fandoms than just My Little Pony. There are pockets of adults that love to overconsume and fetishize kids' media all over the internet. The Steven Universe fandom, for instance, was filled with toxicity, problematic shit, and a lot of the creators actually got harassed. Shows like the new She-Ra and the Owl House actually faced real pushback, criticism, and demands from adult men demanding that certain things be changed or done within the series. And again, look, I don't think it's wrong as an adult to want to watch kids media and engage with it and enjoy it, but can you watch it and not sexualize the little pastel horses next time? Can we do that? I'm not kidding when I tell you that this has been a topic that's been on my mind since I stopped watching the show, because I was so bothered that I basically got chased out of a show that I knew was meant for me and my demographic. As an adult, I don't feel that anybody was wrong for liking what they liked. I just don't understand the things that happened that we've already been over, and more than that, I think it just sucks when there's no boundaries when it comes to kids media, and so it ends up being innocent eyes that shouldn't be seeing what they're seeing, and seeing things created by adults with uninnocent eyes and definitely not innocent intentions and ideas that they just can't help but put out on the internet, and it just turned into a whole thing. The show went on to have a whopping total of 9 seasons, of which I only saw maybe 3 before I just gave up completely. I don't know how the rest of the stories were, but I know that while I was watching it was a show that I found entertaining. I thought it was great, I thought it was well written, there was a lot of drama, there was a lot of great characters, and I really loved the show, and I was so devastated to see it just tarnished in my mind by men doing unspeakable things to little horses. But I figure now, looking back on it, no longer being 11, now being 25 and a little more detached from My Little Pony than I was back then, I think I can look back on it and laugh at the absurdity of how I was chased out of a show that was initially meant, developed, created for little girls, but on the internet, it was turned into 50 Shades of Nay. And that's all from me. I've been SnarkyJay. Thank you so much for watching. Please don't forget to like and subscribe. For more SnarkyJay, be sure to check me out on Instagram. And if you'd like to support me, this channel, and my content creation, do check out and consider subscribing to my Patreon for exclusive photo shoot sets and cosplay content. I'll add links to all of those in the description below. And let me know if you ever had to leave a fandom because the people ruined it for you in the comments below.